It's been said that everybody's got a story to tell. Well, the person we're about to meet tonight, there's no group of people in America more prepared to argue their constitutional rights.
That's how we connect to each
Yeah.
other. That's how we connect to our communities. And that's what we tried to do here
Yes.
at the cafe.
Today, we have the privilege of being in the presence of the one and only Nikole Hannah-Jones, New York Times investigative reporter, co-founder of the Ida B. Wells Society, MacArthur Genius Award winner, and as she says on her Twitter, the Beyonce of journalism.
That's a joke.
Welcome, Nikole. Thank you so much for being here with us.
Thank you.
Now, I've had the privilege of reading and combing through the 1619 Project, and I want you to know I am grateful for your work. I'm thankful for the diligence that you put into telling this story. I know that many people don't know the significance of 1619, and many people of color don't know the significance of 1619. So the question that I'm sure that you're asked often, what incited you to pitch this concept, and what was the response?
Sure. So hey everyone, happy to be here, and I've been trying to go to as many HBCUs as possible, so I was very happy that we could make this happen. So I mean, the kind of longish, but I'll try to tell it in a short way, story is I first heard of the year 1619 when I was a high school student. And my high school, I was bused into a white high school, and our high school offered a one-semester Black Studies course. And I took that course, and really getting books and starting to read books on the Black experience for the first time in my life just changed my world. Like just that one semester where they packed in all of Black history from Africa, ancient Africa, all the way to the Civil Rights Movement in one semester was really transformative for me. And so when the class ended, I kept asking my teacher, give me another book. And every time I would finish a book, I would ask for another one. And there was this book he gave me called Before the Mayflower by Lerone Bennett. And I came across the year 1619, and I just remember thinking people of African descent had been sold into slavery here before the Pilgrims landed at Plymouth Rock, right, before the Mayflower arrived to the United States, or what would become the United States. But everyone had heard about the Mayflower, but no one had ever heard of 1619. And another ship, what I would say was a more momentous ship, which was the White Lion, that brought those first 20 to 30 enslaved people at Port Comfort, which is just a few miles away from Hampton. That was also the same year that I joined my high school newspaper. So those two things kind of happened at the same time. I started thinking about journalism as a career at the same time that I'm starting to learn a lot of Black history and being exposed to the year 1619. So fast forward, last year I was thinking a lot that this 400th anniversary was approaching and that most Americans had never in their life heard the year 1619. I wonder how many of y'all had heard the year 1619 before? Anybody? Yeah, some of you. So most of us had never heard this, and this was going to be the 400th year of what I consider to be one of the most pivotal moments in what would become America. And I wanted to make sure that it was going to be acknowledged in some way. And I'm at the New York Times, I write for the magazine, and I decided that I was going to pitch this project. So I pitched it in January. And what was important to me was that the 1619 Project was not going to be a history of slavery, but that it was going to answer that question that every Black person in America gets, which is slavery was a long time ago, why don't you get over it? So if you read the magazine is about the modern legacy of slavery and showing that across all of American life, there's almost nothing you can look at that cannot be explained by our decision to engage in chattel slavery and the anti-Black racism that followed it. And that was really the objective of the 1619 Project, was to both commemorate this 400 years, but also to show that slavery was central to the development of the United States. It was not marginal, even though we're taught that it's marginal, and that most importantly, Black American contributions are marginalized, and this project says that we are going to take those who have been treated as the bottom and actually put them at the center. So that was a long answer, I guess, right?
No, but that's exactly what you did in the project. And I heard that you also created a style book because you wanted to be very specific on the language utilized so people understood the magnitude of what really took place. Because
Right.
sometimes we utilize words that make it seem like it wasn't as challenging and it wasn't the terrorism that it was. So can you explain a little bit about the type of language that you intentionally utilized in the
Yes.
project?
So we know that I assume everybody in here is a journalism student, and so we understand the power of words and that which words you choose and which words you don't choose and how you describe something makes a huge difference in how you actually think about and conceptualize what it is that you're reading. So what was very important to me was, one, that we would have a uniform style across the magazine and the project, but also that we didn't use words that further dehumanized our ancestors. So I was determined you would never see the word slave talking about human beings unless it was in direct quotes from a historical document, that we would refer to them as enslaved people because slavery was a condition, it was not who they were. Where we could, I tried to avoid using the word plantation because plantation is a very genteel way. It reminds you, makes you think of something off of Gone with the Wind, when in reality these were forced labor, slave labor camps where black people were tortured and terrorized into performing labor. So that was important. I didn't like to use words like slave owner. These were people who, they were enslavers. So all of these kind of words that we have used to obscure the brutality of slavery and to also dehumanize those who were enslaved, I thought it was very important that we not continue to do that in this magazine. So I came up with a style book that went out to all the writers, all the editors, and I also read every single piece, not just for, narrative and flow, but also like I was checking words and language in every single piece that went in there because that was really important to me.
And in addition to the style book, in addition to the very well-written essays, I'm a poet, so I love the fact that it also incorporates art and poetry and paintings. And I mean, was that a part of your original pitch? Did you already have that concept of making sure that you incorporated the various platforms in this piece?
It was not.
It was not, okay.
So I am I'm a journalist, and my pitch was to do journalism, and this was kind of the beauty of the collaborative process in making the project. So when I pitched it, and my editor said, yes, it's absolutely, I pitched to do an entire issue of the magazine dedicated to looking at the modern legacy, and what I really wanted was to have this element of surprise. So there's certain things that we know you can trace back to slavery.
Right.
But most things you don't, like why we don't have universal health care, or why there's traffic jams in Atlanta, or why we consume so much sugar, or our democracy itself. That's really was my idea, was to show, capitalism, that what we want to pretend just occurred in the backwards South and really didn't have a lot to do with our entire country, that we are going to show not only the centrality, but that legacy is still ongoing. But as part of the collaborative process, the editor-in-chief of the magazine's father is a poet, and he actually works with a lot of black poets, and he had just produced a book on liberation that included a lot of black poets. So we were having a discussion one day about, black Americans are the only people in the history of our nation for whom it was ever illegal to read and write. And because of that, so many moments in our history, there's no written record of it written by black people. If a record exists, it is often written by white people. And so we said, well, what if we reimagine these moments in our history for which there is no record written by black people, but allow black writers to write it as if there were. And that's really how we ended up having the pieces of poetry and creative fiction in what we call kind of a literary timeline. And it was beautiful because what I love about the magazine is the entire magazine, if you open it up to the contributors page,
Yes.
is also a testament to the resilience, the resistance, and the 40 million descendants of those first 20 to 30 Africans who were sold into Port Comfort, because 80% of the essays, all of the creative pieces, all of the original art, all of the photography was all done by black writers, black artists, black photographers. And that was really important. If we're going to assess this 400th year, we needed to be the ones producing almost all of that content. We needed to be the ones doing the assessment.
The ones telling our story.
Exactly.
Yeah, and it's phenomenal. I want to take a look at actually the first essay, your essay. We're met with the imagery of an American flag, you and your childhood, your father, and the frustration that you have with your father's allegiance to the flag and to a country that was not loyal to him.
Yes.
And just want to read the quote here. You state, Black Americans have always been and continue to be foundational to the idea of American freedom. More than any other group in this country, we have served generation after generation in an overlooked but vital role. It is we who have been the perfecters of this democracy. Can you expound on that for me?
Yeah, so my essay can be seen as kind of the introduction to the whole project. And I really wanted to set the stage because so much of the project necessarily is about things that white Americans did to Black people and the way that white Americans sought to dehumanize and oppress us. So it was necessary that before you went into all of those stories that we set the stage about Black people's unique role. And we're all raised understanding that we were brought here and used as labor. And often the way that it's taught is that it was unskilled labor, which was not true, that we were just brute, we were just brute laborers picking cotton. A lot of us did that, but we also had a lot of intellectual contributions. We had certain knowledge, for instance, inoculation practices came from an enslaved person. The ability to cultivate rice was a technology that Africans brought and taught the colonists, irrigation systems, ironworking. You're never taught about any of those things. And so to me, what you're also certainly never taught about is that our Constitution, when it was written, was not a democratic document, and it was not a document of liberation, at least not for most of the people in the country. Women couldn't vote under that Constitution, Native people couldn't vote, and Black people certainly couldn't vote, and Black people, in fact, were codified as property under the Constitution. But Black Americans actually believed the founding words, even when the founders who were enslavers did not. And what my essay is really talking about is how, I would imagine like many of y'all, I grew up, and really until 5 months ago when I started writing this essay, feeling that I could not be fully American. I could not claim this country as mine. Always felt in opposition to my own country, even though this is the only country that we've ever known, right? Like we've been here generations. We have no other language. We have no other culture. This is our culture. But taught to feel both ashamed and also like we couldn't claim this. And here my dad is like flying this American flag in our front yard. And as a kid, I was really embarrassed by it, and I didn't understand it. I was literally the only Black person I knew whose parent was like flying a flag in the front yard. And my dad was a veteran, so clearly we're in a place where one can understand that particular type of patriotism that Black veterans who join the military hoping that if they fight for their country would finally recognize them as full citizens. So the essay is really me understanding what my dad knew, but I didn't, which is no one actually has a greater claim to this country than we do, because Black people have fought before the Revolutionary War all the way till now to actually make those founding documents true. And it is through Black resistance that we have as much democracy as we have today. And so my essay is really trying to turn on our heads the way that we have been taught, not just about our founders and our founding origins, but about the role that Black people have played, and that we weren't just here as laborers. We actually were here as like the perfecters of democracy. We are actually the ones who believed in equality for all people and fought to make that true. And because of that, of course, I'm arguing that, of course, my dad had a right to fly that flag, and no one should be allowed to make us feel that we don't have a right to claim this country, because while white Americans fought other wars in other places for democracy, we fought those wars and then had to come back home and fight our own citizens to make that democracy true.
And in fighting the war at home, as you mentioned, your father was a veteran. In addition to the brutality that many Black veterans experience, as it's echoed in the 1619 Project, it's also, you all don't shy away from addressing the terrorism that Black people experience abroad. And you didn't hold back any punches, not only in the essays, but also in the imagery as well. And in one of the statements, you mentioned how showing that violence, it was a necessity. Can you explain why it's necessary for people to understand what we really went through?
Yeah, so there's two things that happen in the narrative that we're taught about this country and slavery and the period of Jim Crow, which actually I interviewed a scholar last week, and she was like, we should never refer to that period as Jim Crow again, that it was a period of extended racial terrorism, and that's what we should call it. It was really 100 years of racial terror, and Jim Crow also sounds benign. But what's important to understand is we're kind of taught, the way that we're taught this history is that black people just acquiesced to our enslavement, that we just allowed it to happen, and we didn't. We resisted, and any resistance was met with the most extreme type of violence. And that violence served a purpose, right? Like, there was a reason that we were lynched publicly. There was a reason that black people who resisted would be flogged in the public square or be buried in the ground with just their heads out, allowing the bugs to attack their face and their body, strung up by the arms in the town square, because this was a message to every other black person that if you step out of place, this is going to happen to you. No one labors for free. No one submits to their enslavement, right? It was a system that had to be very brutal to force people to continue to live under it. But we are not taught about that brutality because that is how white people can believe that they have clean hands, which is slavery wasn't really that bad. And it's simply not true. And then you think about the 100 years after slavery, where we're taught as if the Civil War ended and then white people repented and we just went on and became a great country. But what happened is black people were forced into a system of quasi-slavery that lasted 100 years of legal apartheid, and that was also violently enforced both in the North and the South. So not talking about that violence then allows us to pretend that this was not a system of subjugation, that we were resisting, but that was violently tamped down in every possible way. And the violence also served another purpose, which I also talk about in my essay, which is the way that, our country was created based on a fundamental hypocrisy, which is the Declaration and the Constitution, which says, all men are created equal, endowed by the Creator with inalienable rights. Like, most Americans can say those lines without even having to look. They're some of the most famous words in the English language. Those words were written while 1/5 of the population was living in absolute bondage with none of those rights. And the way that you get over that hypocrisy is to say that those people are not human. So the we the people of the Constitution is not a lie, because black people are not human or citizens. So therefore, the we the people doesn't include them. And therefore, we can pretend that this was not a country based on a profound hypocrisy. The way that you stamp that in humanity is through violence. So when you think about the history of lynching, where black people weren't just killed, but dismembered. There's a case in Atlanta, where every knuckle was taken off of the man's body while he was living and displayed in storefront windows, and people would pass around body parts and keep them in their attics as keepsakes. Or, black people whose body parts were dismembered, and they would drive into the black part of town and throw those body parts onto the lawns of black people as a sign. These are things you wouldn't do to an animal. So when you do these human beings, then it only affirms for you that actually the way that we're treating them and the fact that we enslaved them was okay, because they actually were not humans. So if we didn't engage with that, the level of constant violence that black people faced, then we wouldn't be telling the truth about why black people suffer for so long, even in places where we were in the majority. We have to understand that violence. With that said, it was hard to figure out what's the right balance, because while I didn't want people to be able to pretend that our country was not as brutal as it was, but also I don't want to further traumatize and dehumanize black people who are having to turn those pages and see that imagery. So there's a lynching photo in my essay, and it was probably 2 days before we were closing the magazine. There was a different photo. And in the photo, it was two black men who had been hung, and you could see their faces, and it was very close up, and it was big. And my stomach was just hurting about it. And finally, I called one of my black journalist friends, and I was like, just look at this image and tell me, like, should we run it? Because on the one hand, we're journalists, and I'm like, this is the truth, this happened. On the other hand, I'm like, do Black people really need to turn the page and see this image? And he agreed with me, so I went to my editors and I was like, I don't think we should run that photo, let's find a different one. And we still pictured lynching because it's necessary, but in a photo where it's blurrier and the person, you can't see their features. So it was also trying to make those decisions about balancing telling the truth with not further dehumanizing our ancestors who already have been dehumanized in so many ways. And it was, you know, I've said this and it's true, I don't know a Black person who worked on this project who did not cry at least one time during the making of it. And some of us cried multiple times because it was definitely the hardest work that I've ever had to do. And just sitting in the horror and the brutality that our people have had to go through for like 7 months on end, like living and breathing it every day, it was a lot. But also wanting to do right by their stories and this legacy was a lot.
I'm about to cry just talking to you. Thank you for your work. Thank you for what you have done. Did you know that that you would get the response that you've gotten from this project?
Yeah, absolutely not. I knew that we were doing a big ass project on slavery, a subject that most white Americans don't want to hear about or talk about, and a subject that many Black Americans, even with the Harriet film, you saw these takes like, do we need another slavery film? Haven't we talked about this enough? So that even many of us don't want to deal with. But I also knew that it was something that on my spirit we had to do, and that hopefully by not telling a history, but really showing the modern legacy, we could give our country, and particularly Black Americans, a way to understand the conditions that we're in without buying the narrative, which is we're in the conditions we're in because we choose them, as opposed to there's an entire architecture that has been set up to create them. So no, I had no idea. I kind of had a clue. I sent out, I'm fairly active on Twitter. I sent out a tweet like a week before it published just saying, this thing is coming. And as I'm writing, I'm always kind of processing on Twitter. I share things that I'm reading as I'm reading them. I tweet out sources when I find something interesting. So folks knew I was working on something kind of related to this. And the response just to that tweet was kind of crazy. So I was like, okay, maybe people are going to engage with it. But I didn't think that we would sell out all over the country, that folks would be posting like videos like they were in line for like the new pair of Jordans to get, you know, a very heavy project on slavery. Someone like wrote me an angry letter to my house because they couldn't get a copy. That was going too far, just in case anybody wondered. Yeah, it's been insane. And one thing that was really important to me was that the typical New York Times subscriber is white and wealthy, and they certainly need to read this as well, but I didn't want to produce something that the people who have been most impacted by this legacy would never see. So I personally fundraised to print 200,000 additional copies. The copies that have gone to Hampton were from that fundraising effort, and we've been sending copies to HBCUs, to school districts that serve a lot of Black kids, like all over the country for free, because it was also important to me that our communities have access to this project as well.
Absolutely, absolutely. Now, in addition to the 1619 project, now there is a curriculum as well. Now, when you guys first started on the project, was that in the works as well?
So we talked about it. The Times produces curriculum. Where is this being? It's not very good. And so we talked about it internally, but really didn't feel like we had the proper expertise to produce our own curriculum. But we certainly hoped that what we produced would be taught in schools. But then we ended up partnering with the Pulitzer Center, and the Pulitzer Center is actually the organization that arranged this talk today. And they do curriculum based off of journalism. And so that came a little pretty far into the project, maybe halfway into us working on the project, that partnership came about. But they have created a really excellent curriculum. And I know the 1619 project is being taught in public schools or schools in every state in the country. Every high school student or every high school in Chicago is teaching it. The project has gone to every high school in Houston, every high school in DC. So that's been a really kind of amazing, unexpected part of it.
And that's a huge part because we need this education to get to our middle school and high school audiences so they know. So the kids know their value, the black and brown girls, boys and girls know their value, but also they have a better understanding of what happened, the true history, since that narrative isn't being told. So
yeah, for sure. Like if you think about, I mean, the whole reason this project has to exist is most of us are taught about this history so poorly. You know, I haven't been in high school in a few years. But I was trying to remember, what did I actually learn about slavery when I was in school? And, you know, a couple paragraphs in your history book. And usually, the only time you learn about slavery is they have to explain the Civil War. And so they give you a couple paragraphs about slavery because of the Civil War. And that's it. And as a black person, you know there's more to the story, but you're not getting what that more to the story is. And as white people, you're basically taught like it really didn't matter that much. It was just, you know, this small thing that somehow managed to bring millions of, you know, black people. It's the only reason black people exist in the country, but that it was not profitable, and it wasn't central, and that was a Southern thing, and it wasn't a Northern thing. And my hope is that by having this curriculum taught in schools, we don't have to reteach people as adults, that our children will learn a more correct history from the beginning. And I don't know about y'all, but I just remember growing up just feeling a lot of shame that our history began with slavery. The way that we were taught was like, we let white people steal us, we let white people enslave us, and then we let white people free us. There was no agency, there was no resistance. You learn about Harriet Tubman, but you don't learn really why you learn about Harriet Tubman. You just knew she was a slave who ran away. Not that she was a woman who was like a Union spy who like led a raid and freed 200 and something people, that she was like going back in and you know, hostile territory. You don't learn any of those things. You don't learn about the system that she was working against. And instead, you're just taught like, you don't have your own names, you don't have your own language, that things were just done to us, and that we had to be ashamed, and we had to look to the continent of Africa, a place we've never been, a place where we don't know the language, to feel some sense of pride, that we could have no pride in what we built here. And we all are kind of awash in that shame, and unless someone teaches us a different story, we all grow up under that. And my essay is speaking, you know, very clearly pushing against that narrative and saying we have nothing to be ashamed of. We didn't do this to ourselves. We fought every step of the way. We fought and resisted and really built this country. And after everything they tried to do to us, as the sociologist Glenn Bracey said, out of white denigration, we created ourselves. That we created an amazing people right here on this land. And I just think, what will it mean for that 5-year-old or 8-year-old or 10-year-old black child to grow up with that sense of who they are, and not the sense that most of us grew up in, that there was something shameful about our past, which is just simply not true.
not true. Now, for the little black girl or boy having that sense of pride, this information is giving them that. What do you hope for the white boy or girl that's getting this information?
So my hope for the white boy or girl or white adult is that this project will help them lose their sense of superiority, the sense that they are better than black folks, the sense that their history matters and ours doesn't. How can you ever have equality if the majority race has a sense that they are superior over you and that their history is superior over yours? I hope that we will have a real sense of who we are as a country, because when we're talking about all of the inequality that exists today, and folks say, well, slavery ended 150 years ago, so why are you still complaining? Well, when you can actually show them how these systems continued, how they just adapt, how we never actually try to make amends and restitution for what happened, then I think they have to be more open to how do we actually fix it. You know, you cannot learn about Thomas Jefferson writing the Okay, well, I won't say you cannot. You should not be able to learn about Thomas Jefferson writing the Declaration without saying this man owned 130 human beings at that time. It's the only reason he had the money and the power to be in a position to write the Declaration that would go out to the world to say we wanted to be a new country. And that as he's writing those words, his enslaved brother-in-law, his wife's brother, whom they own, is there to keep him comfortable. If you understand those stories together, that yes, he did a great thing, and yes, he did really terrible things, then you really can understand the real America, and then you can say, okay, we owe something, and we have to do something to make it right. But when you allow white Americans to have this, to deify our founders, to deify our founding, to have this sense of oblivion about the way that race has played a role, particular to Black people. And this is why, this is not a project about people of color.
Right.
Our caste system was built on Black people. Anti-Black racism is very specific and particular, and that experience is particular. And so I also hope that those who are not Black or white, or if you're Black and you immigrated from another country, if you are the child of immigrants or grandchild of immigrants, that you will also come to understand that your existence here is also owed to the struggle of Black Americans, that most Black and brown immigrants couldn't even come to the United States until after 1965 because of the Black civil rights movement that ended racist immigration quotas. Prior to that, in order to try to keep the country white, the federal government limited the number of immigrants who could come from Africa, South America, Latin America, and Asia. In 1965, those quotas end. And most immigrants of color who come here after came into a country where it was no longer legal to discriminate against you because of your race or nationality, thanks to the Black American struggle. Yet, when those immigrant groups come here, many of them seek to distance themselves from Black Americans. So what I hope is, by reading this story, instead of distancing themselves, that there will be an appreciation for the Black freedom struggle and the rights and privileges that it has gained for all Americans, including immigrants of color. So when people ask, who did I do this project for? I did this project for all Americans, but I hope, depending on what kind of American you are, that you will take something different from the project, which is basically that Black people are amazing.
Exactly. And since we're in front of several Black, phenomenal, amazing future journalists, we want to definitely give them an opportunity to ask questions because you're at the top of your game, and we have young people that are aspiring to be where you are. So if you could share some insight and give them an opportunity to, if anybody has any questions for our special guest.
Hi, my name is Anissa Sago. I am a senior journalism major from Brooklyn, New York. And reading.
You're from Brooklyn?
Yes.
What neighborhood?
Fort Greene.
Okay.
Where are you from?
I live in Bed-Stuy. I'm from Iowa.
Okay, I live in Crown Heights. Okay. So, reading your story and going through the article, being able to have the opportunity to break it down and understand, how was it writing it and pitching it to people at the New York Times, especially with who is above it, which may be white people? How did they take to it, and did you find any discomfort when writing it, like going through like your story, talking about your grandmother and your dad as well?
Great question.
Thank you.
Questions. So I'll answer the last one first, which is the most common question I get, which is, how did you get the New York Times to do this project? And honestly, I got zero pushback on this, which is shocking to everyone, and maybe was a little shocking to me too. I'm in a particular place in my career at the Times, and so when I came in, I worked with great editors, and I pitched the project like immediately. My direct editor said, yes, go pitch it to the editor-in-chief, and he immediately said, yes, let's do it. And then between like that, those of us at our special projects editor just kept expanding and expanding. So it's not a typical experience, I don't believe, but for me it was not hard to pitch. And actually we got a kind of a ridiculous amount of resources to do the project. The writing was hell, let's just say that. I do long form writing. I probably read 15 books for this piece. I do a lot of research, a lot of historical research, and had to try to condense then down everything that I had read and figure out what's the narrative. I've just felt a lot of psychic pressure that this is commemorating the 400th year. I'm doing the opening essay to the project that I pitched. So one, I can't have the weak essay, but two, really trying to do right by our ancestors and produce something that was worthy of the 400th years that I was trying to commemorate. It was actually debilitating at times. There were, my husband would tell you, like, he would walk in the room and be like, okay, I'm just gonna leave because I see I should not talk to you right now. It was hard. And it was hard just because there was a lot of material, but it was hard because of what I was trying to do. The way the piece opens with my dad was not how I opened the piece. And I don't know, how many of you guys are print journalists here? Dang, nobody want to be a print journalist? Okay. But everybody writes, right? No matter what type of journalism you do. So I would say you are all print journalists to a degree. So some folks can start in the middle if they can't get their lead. Some folks can just start right in the middle. I'm not like that. I have to write in order. So if I can't get my lead, I can't go. And I struggled for days and days. I couldn't think of how to open the piece. And I finally went to call my editor. I was like laying in bed, like paralyzed, literally. Like, this is a mess. Everybody who wants to, writing is a mess, right? And you should take comfort in knowing that every person who you love as a writer struggles to write, all of us. And we all have to be edited too, because what we turn in definitely doesn't look like what you guys ever get a chance to see. So I was laying in bed and I called her and I was like, I cannot write this, like I cannot do it. And she was like, okay, why don't you just start with that story you told me about Thomas Jefferson? And I was like, okay, I'm gonna start with that. And I started writing it, and like my gut was just like, that's not right. Like, you cannot start our story with the white man who enslaved us. Like, you cannot do that. And I am not a religious person at all, but I swear the ancestors like threw this line in my head. So it actually starts the last section. It's a piece, if you guys heard the podcast, it's the opening line of the podcast, which is, they say our people were born on the water. That just came in my head, and I actually wrote that last section as the top, and that liberated me to write the whole piece. And then when I turned it in, the editor-in-chief was like, you should start with your dad. So I end the piece with my dad and the flag. And he was like, you should start the piece with that, which I opposed because I didn't think I should start the history of Black people in this country with my family either. That also didn't feel right. And in the end, he just said, just try it, write it, and then if you still feel strongly about it, we won't do it. And I wrote it, and then I was like, begrudgingly, when you have to tell your editor actually you didn't know what the hell you were talking about. Yeah.
I feel like
so I was like, you were right.
It grabbed, like when it starts off like
Yeah.
that, it just grabs the reader like, oh, okay, she's against
He
it.
was right. He was right. In general, of course, journalists should not be telling our own stories, right? Our jobs are to tell other people's stories. But this was an essay, and in this case, I think it did work. But I will say, the writing process for a long form is just very challenging. And the only thing I think that can make it easier is organization. And most journalists are actually not that organized. So when you're writing something short, you might have notepads here, and you're like, I know I had a quote over here, you can't find it. That will kill you in long form. You can't do it. So I actually use a software called Scrivener. You guys ever heard of Scrivener? So it's a software that book writers and academics who are writing dissertations use, and it's just a way to organize all of your research in one place. And you can kind of create timelines and all of that, and that's the only thing that saved me. But the short of it was hell. I probably revised it 10 times before it got to the point of where you guys are seeing it. It was twice as long when I turned it in, which my editor really loves when I turn in something that's twice as long as it's supposed to be. But it's a process. All good writing is a process. Your first draft will rarely ever be very good. But this in general was more challenging just because of the subject matter and what I was trying to do. So thank you. I mean, keep in mind, y'all, the New York Times is a paper of record. So when you guys are doing your own research, when you're reading books and people want to know what happened 50 years ago or 100 years ago, they look in the New York Times and see how the New York Times covered things. So I'm thinking about this as we're producing this, is like, this thing is going to be in the historic record. Like 100 years from now, people will see what was written here, and it better live up to that expectation, that when people are going back and saying, how was the 400th year commemorated, or how did we deal with this? It just had to be worthy of that. And that was a lot of pressure. Hi.
Hi, how you doing?
Great, how are you?
I'm fine, thank you for asking. My name is Kobe Polk. I'm a journalism major, theater minor from Atlanta, Georgia. And so my question for you is, as mentioned before, this work incorporates a large array of different types of artwork, not only poetry and essays, but also pieces of art, photographs, and things like that. So how do you go about formatting and organizing all that information so that the story that you want to display to us as the readers, how do you organize all that information so that it still comes across clear and doesn't get lost in all the different collections of artwork and poetry and essays, so that we can still understand what you want to tell to us? Because I remember you talking, you were saying that storyline and the overall story of how it is important for us to know where we came from and what we are going to, so that we know where we came from and all of that. So how do you format all that information so that that overall sense doesn't get lost in all the artwork, and working with all the different collaborators? Because I know that working with different people, ideas might start to get skewered in certain processes. So what is your, I guess my question is, what is your words of wisdom for people who want to do that same type of project but still want the overall sense or the overall message to come across clear without getting lost in all of that?
So great, that's a great question. And what's important to know is every single thing in there was carefully deliberated on, like everything. Like, what's the order of the essays? What case are we building, starting with the beginning to the very last thing you see, which is the photo essay of the Howard Law School graduates, right? What's the balance of text to white space? Because all of us know when you see a lot of text, you're like, okay, I'm not dealing with this. So how do you break up that space? How do we incorporate the fiction pieces and signal to the reader that this is different from the other parts that you're seeing? So that was a big part of design. The design team spent a lot of time figuring out how to make all of the pieces work. There were lots of meetings. We print out every page and lay it out on the wall and look at how it looks, and we're constantly tweaking that. We opened with an explanation of what we were trying to do and what you were going to see inside. So when people saw poetry, they knew it was coming, as opposed to like you're reading these heavy essays and you're like, well, what is this? So I think we were careful. All of the photos except the opening photos are black and white, right? All of the paths, like there's just all of these things that we were thinking about the whole time. Even signaling in the contributors page that you're gonna see poets, you're gonna see original artwork, letting the reader know that. But these were things, we spent a lot of time thinking about every single element. This whole project was like very fraught. Because of the subject matter, we all were very conscious. We did not want to make a mistake. We didn't want to mess anything up. We didn't want to give anyone the opportunity to criticize it. I was particularly concerned about how Black people would react with it, interact and react to it. I knew it was going to be mixed with white people depending on the reader, but I really wanted us to be proud of it. So we thought about everything. And a lot of times design is kind of a secondary thought to the text, but I don't think it should be, because design is often what carries you through something. And all of those decisions that you don't think about as a reader, that's what design are thinking about. Like even the cover. So we didn't shoot that cover till like the week before it had to close, because we could not think of what is the proper cover for a 400 commemoration. We had a lot of ideas, and most of them were bad. I think the second to the last idea was to shoot like an eye, and then have like the American flag in the eye. And I was like, okay, that's gonna be cheesy. Let's not do that. And we finally decided, like, let's just go back to the water. Like, that's where our story begins. Let's shoot it on the water. And again, it's trying to make sure it has the proper tone. What's the color? What should it look like? Like all of those things, you have just tons of meetings. It's what made me learn I don't want to be in management, because you just spend your whole life in meetings.
Well, thank you.
You're welcome.
Hi.
Hello.
My name is Jordan Grandison. I'm a junior journalism and communications major, marketing minor from Brooklyn, New York. And my question to you is basically, I know that you explained that America kind of has a history of kind of saying that we are like the land of the free, home of the brave, like that kind of concept, but they also tend to like shy away from our narrative as African Americans. So as us being like young black journalists or like anything else like authors, what would be your advice for us to like keep that black narrative in mind as we're like writing?
Yes, so I always say, you know, the reason mainstream America wants to shy away from our stories is we're the most inconvenient thing to the American story, right? Like the only reason we exist is because this country was, you know, based on hypocrisy, or otherwise we wouldn't even be here. So I think that, I mean, black journalists should be free to write about whatever they want to write about. If you don't want to write about race, you shouldn't have to. But the only reason I ever became a journalist was to write about black folks and to write about racial inequality. I would not have been a journalist if I couldn't do that. So I think that we have to understand as black journalists that being born into our experience definitely gives us a perspective, but it doesn't make us an expert. So when people want to know why am I good at what I do, yes, being born black helps. I see stories that other people don't see, but I've studied the hell out of my craft. You know, just like a science reporter learns science, I read obsessively on history, I read obsessively on sociology of race, economics of race. So if this is something that you really want to do, be an expert in it. Otherwise, the coverage is just superficial. So much race writing is writing that says black people suffer from this. Black people have the worst at this. Black people have the highest at this, with no explication of how that happened, why that has occurred. You guys are young, you probably haven't seen The Matrix, right?
Yes.
Okay, listen, I've been to college and seen Blake Stairs when I bring up The Matrix, but so if you've seen The Matrix and you know there's a red pill and the blue pill. And the blue pill allows you to just go back to your life and pretend you don't know how any of this is created. And the red pill allows you to see the architecture behind everything, right? All of the systems that have created this reality. Great race writing is like taking the red pill. Great race writing is exposing that architecture. So you're not just saying schools are segregated, or you're not just saying black people experience the highest rates of incarceration or the highest rates of diabetes. You're actually able to use history and sociology and science to like show why this is. That to me is what we should aspire to. And if you can do those types of stories, I think it is easier to pitch stories about race to editors who don't really care. Because you have the rigor of the argument that you can make, and that's what set my work aside, and that's what sets aside the best race writing in the country.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
Hi, how are you? My
Hi.
name is Paige Monet Voge. I'm a senior journalism major from Brooklyn, New York. So my question
Brooklyn is
is,
represented here.
I know, a lot of New York people here. So my question is, being a minority in the workplace, like how are you able to still tell your truth without like worrying about what your coworkers or like your boss might think? Like how are you able to censor yourself but like still tell your truth, or were you not thinking about that at all? Like were you just saying like I'm gonna tell my story and I don't really care about what, you guys' opinions or beliefs?
So I always get that question too, and this is what I'll say. Me being here doing this type of work was not inevitable. And there were many people along the way who did not want me to do the type of journalism that I wanted to do. They didn't want me to look and talk the way that I do. 8 years ago, I almost left the profession altogether because I would be pitching stories about race and about black people, and my editor said I was biased, that I wanted to cover that too much, that those weren't the stories that I should be telling. And I had to make a decision, about whether I was going to compromise myself to succeed or risk not succeeding. And I chose that I was just going to keep trying to tell these stories, and I was going to have to deal with the consequences, but there were consequences. Luckily, I I couldn't leave journalism because I couldn't actually think of anything else I wanted to do with my life. But most of the people, other black journalists and journalists of color who started with me, who I was friends with when I first started, are not in the business anymore, and often for that very reason. So what I say is you have to make the decision on what is worth it to you. Is success the most important thing, or is doing the type of journalism that you got into to do the most important thing, and having and holding on to kind of your core moral value about the work you want to do? And what that might mean is you don't get to the place that you want to get to. But to me, if I got to the New York Times by compromising myself, it wouldn't have been worth it. So luckily it worked out for me this way, and I can say I got here intact. I am fully who I am, but the odds were not in my favor, and most other people like me didn't get to where I am. It's not uplifting, it's just the facts.
Yeah, thank you.
You're welcome. But let me add just one thing to that, though. But you can do it, right? The one thing that you have is your excellence. And this is what I tell black students all the time. You can't mitigate people's racism. You can't mitigate whether they want you to write about your people or not. You can't mitigate whether they don't like that your hair is big and bright red and you wear nails because you like that, right? Like, you can't mitigate any of that stuff. The only thing you control is how excellent you are. And that is the only thing that will be the buffer between what they want and expect from you and what you want and expect for yourself. That's what you control. So I don't think I have to tell students at Hampton, right? I know so many Hampton grads who are just exemplars of people who are able to be themselves and rise in their career. I think this institution teaches you that. But that is the thing that you control, and that's the thing that you have to control. And then find folks in the newsroom who will have your back. Like, people, older black journalists saved me because I could go to them, they could guide me, they could navigate certain things for me. If you guys don't go to NABJ, you absolutely should. I know it's expensive, but that's 2,000 folks who just want to see you succeed and who will help open the door for you, who you can go to when you don't feel like you can go to the other people in your institutions. So all you can do is control the things that you can, and everything else is outside of your control and you can't worry about it. You're welcome.
Any last questions? I want to say thank you so much for being here with us. Let's give a round of applause for Nicole. I think you've given all of us a lot to think about. And has everybody received their copy? You combed through, and so now we have to go and share this information with other people. Thank you for the work that you're doing and for the knowledge that you've shared with us. You've made all of our lives a lot better just by being here. So thank you so very much.
Thank you, and thank y'all. I'm proud of y'all. Thank you.
Thank you.